The year is 1891. We are in Manchester, New Hampshire, standing on the floor of the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company. It is a cathedral of industry filled with the deafening rhythm of textile machinery. But deep inside the engine room, the rhythm is about to break. Without a single warning siren, the floorboards begin to tremble violently. In the center of the room, a 56-ton iron wheel, spinning at full operational speed, suddenly disintegrates. This isn't a mechanical breakdown, it is an explosion. In a fraction of a second, massive fragments of cast iron, weighing thousands of pounds, are launched outward like artillery fire. They punch through 3-foot-thick brick walls as if they were made of paper. Steam lines rupture, filling the air with blinding, scalding fog. By the time the dust settles, 3 men are dead, and the mill yard looks like a war zone. Debris is scattered across the complex, some pieces having flown so far they crossed the river. This wasn't a boiler explosion caused by fire or pressure. It was the sudden, catastrophic release of pure kinetic energy. This is the forgotten story of the industrial flywheel, the massive spinning giants that powered the 19th century, and the terrifying price paid when they failed. Chapter 2. The Necessity of Giants. Tone. Informative, explanatory, historical. To understand why these monsters existed, we have to look at the limitations of steam power. In the late 19th century, the steam engine was the undisputed king of energy, but it was a flawed monarch. Steam engines are inherently violent and pulsing. Power is delivered in strokes. The piston surges forward, then stops, then returns. For a sawmill, this pulsing motion didn't matter much. But for a textile mill, where thousands of delicate threads were being spun simultaneously, a pulsating engine was a disaster. Uneven motion snapped threads, jammed complex looms, and ruined products. The difference between profit and bankruptcy was smooth, continuous motion. Enter the flywheel. Engineers realized that the only way to smooth out the violent kicks of a steam piston was to attach it to a massive rotating weight. The flywheel acted as a mechanical battery. It absorbed the surge of energy from the piston stroke and released it during the pause between strokes. The heavier the wheel, the smoother the operation. And so the wheels grew. By the 1870s, a typical mill flywheel weighed between 20 and 50 tons. In the largest industrial complexes, these wheels grew to truly gargantuan proportions, exceeding 100 tons in weight and spanning 30 feet in diameter. These were not auxiliary components, they were the absolute heart of the factory. A single flywheel often drove the mainline shaft that powered an entire complex. Hundreds of looms, presses, and carding machines all drank from the momentum of this one spinning object. If the flywheel slowed, the factory slowed. If it stopped, production died. But there was another economic reason for their size. Stopping and restarting a massive steam engine was incredibly expensive in terms of fuel and labor. A heavy flywheel carried so much momentum that it allowed the engine to power through sudden spikes in load without stalling. It was the ultimate stabilizer to the Victorian factory owner, and these wheels were symbols of efficiency and stability. But to the laws of physics, they were something else entirely. They were bombs waiting for a trigger. Chapter 3. The Physics of the Trap. Tone. Analytical, slightly ominous, scientific. Why were these machines so dangerous? The answer lies in the deceptively simple physics of rotation. A flywheel does not consume energy, it stores it. At a typical operating speed of 60 revolutions per minute, a massive industrial flywheel held an amount of energy comparable to a train moving at speed. But unlike a train, this energy wasn't going anywhere. It was trapped in a circle, spinning in place, feet away from human workers. The critical danger lay in the relationship between speed and stress. The energy stored in a flywheel is proportional to its mass, but it is proportional to the square of its speed. This means that a small increase in rotation doesn't just add a little bit of danger, it multiplies it. If a mechanical governor failed and allowed the engine to speed up by just 10%, the internal stress on the wheel didn't rise by 10%. It rose by over 20%. If the speed doubled, the stress quadrupled. Furthermore, the very design of the wheel worked against it. To maximize inertia, engineers pushed the mass to the outside edge, to the rim, but as the wheel spun, centrifugal force tried to tear that rim apart. Every inch of iron at the edge of the wheel was constantly trying to fly outward, held back only by the tensile strength of the metal itself. And that brings us to the fatal flaw of the era, the material. Almost all these wheels were made of cast iron. Cast iron is a wonderful material for supporting weight. It has incredible compressive strength. You can pile tons of brick on a cast iron column and it will hold. But cast iron is terrible at being pulled apart. Its tensile strength is low and it is brittle. Under the extreme tension of high-speed rotation, cast iron doesn't stretch or give warning signs like steel might. It simply snaps. To make matters worse, these wheels were too large to be cast in one piece. They were built in sections, segments of the rim bolted together. Each joint, each bolt, introduced a potential weak point, a place for stress to concentrate. The engineers of the day were essentially building massive centrifugal torture devices out of a material that hated to be stretched, and then spinning them until they were on the verge of exploding. See Chapter 4, The Invisible Threat. Tone, suspenseful, psychological. There is a psychological aspect to this danger that makes it even more terrifying. In the 19th century, industrial danger usually had a face. You could see the fire of a furnace, you could hear the hissing pressure of a boiler, you could smell the smoke. But a flywheel was a silent killer. At 60 revolutions per minute, a 30-foot wheel looks calm. It's hypnotic. You can't see the stress. You can't see the millions of pounds of force trying to rip the atoms of the iron apart. To the workers, the flywheel was just a constant, steady presence in the engine room. It was a source of wind, a source of vibration, but rarely seen as a source of imminent death. This normalization of danger was the real trap. These wheels ran continuously, sometimes for weeks without stopping. This cycle of heating up and cooling down, of bearing loads and easing off, created microscopic fatigue cracks deep inside the metal. There were no X-rays, no ultrasound sensors to detect them. A wheel could look perfectly sound on the outside while rotting from the inside, waiting for that one moment when the centrifugal force finally overwhelmed the iron's grip. And when that moment came, there was no time to run. Survivors of flywheel explosions often reported the same thing. There was no sound of failure before the event. One moment the engine was humming, the next, the world had ended. The timeline of a flywheel burst is measured in milliseconds. Chapter 5. Anatomy of a Disaster. Tone, action-oriented, descriptive, intense. Let's reconstruct what happens during a failure. It is a sequence of violence that modern engineers still study with horror. Imagine a governor belt snaps, the steam valves on the engine lock into the open position. The engine, suddenly freed from its load regulation, begins to race. The flywheel accelerates. The hum of the machine rises in pitch. Inside the rim of the wheel, the centrifugal force spikes. The iron begins to stretch microscopically. Suddenly, a hairline crack in a casting flaw gives way. The wheel does not crumble. It detonates. When the rim fractures, the pieces are no longer traveling in a circle. According to Newton's laws, they immediately travel in a straight line tangent to the circle. If the rim was moving at 60 miles per hour, that fragment, weighing perhaps 2 tons, is now a cannonball moving at 60 miles per hour. In the Amoskeag disaster, and dozens like it across America and Europe, the destruction defied belief. Iron segments severed 12-inch timber beams like matchsticks. They pulverized brick walls. In some recorded cases, fragments were launched with such velocity that they exited the engine house, flew over the factory yard, and crashed through the roof of a neighboring building, killing workers who didn't even know they were in danger. There was no safe direction. If a piece released from the top of the spin, it went through the roof, sometimes landing hundreds of yards away in the town. If it released at the bottom, it tore through the foundation, shattering the bedrock. If it released at the side, it scythed through the factory floor at chest height, and the destruction didn't stop with the impact. When the wheel shattered, Or the main line shafts would seize or snap, steam pipes, severed by the flying iron, would unleash high-pressure jets of blinding steam, scalding anyone who survived the initial impact. The engine room, once the heart of the mill, became a tomb of twisted metal and vapor. Chapter 6. The Slow Awakening. Tone. Critical, reflective. You might assume that after a few of these disasters the industry would rush to ban these machines, but you would be wrong. The Industrial Revolution was powered by a grim calculation. Production often outweighed safety. For decades, these accidents were treated as acts of God, or blamed on operator error. The systemic risk of storing that much energy indoors was ignored because there was no alternative. The factories needed smooth power, and the giant flywheel was the only way to get it. However, the sheer scale of the destruction eventually forced a change. Insurance companies began to demand answers. They started charging exorbitant premiums for uncontained flywheels. Engineering journals began to catalog the failures, noting a disturbing pattern. These weren't isolated incidents. They were happening everywhere, from Pennsylvania steel mills to British textile plants. The initial engineering response was containment. If we can't stop them from exploding, can we catch the shrapnel? Factories began building massive wooden and steel shelters around the wheels. Others dug deep pits, sinking the lower half of the wheel below ground so that if it burst, at least half the energy would be absorbed by the earth. But even these measures were imperfect. A 2-ton fragment moving at highway speeds cares very little for a wooden barrier. The real solution wouldn't come from better armor, it would come from a better power source. Chapter 7. The Quiet Extinction. Tone. Optimistic. Concluding. Summarizing. The reign of the spinning giants wasn't ended by legislation, it was ended by electricity. As the 20th century dawned, the electric motor began to mature. This technology offered something the steam engine never could: distributed power. Instead of one massive engine turning one massive shaft with one massive flywheel, a factory could now install hundreds of small electric motors, one for every machine. This shift changed the fundamental equation of risk. An electric motor carries only a fraction of the energy of a giant flywheel. If a motor fails, it might smoke, it might spark, but it doesn't level the building. The risk was no longer concentrated in a lethal point. It was distributed and manageable. Slowly, the great engine houses went silent, the massive belts were cut, the line shafts were taken down, and the giant flywheels, once the pride of the industrial age, were stopped for the last time. Many were scrapped, melted down to build the very machines that replaced them. Others were simply walled up in abandoned basements, forgotten tombs of potential energy. Chapter 8. Conclusion. Tone, final, philosophical, impactful. Today, we look back at the era of the giant flywheel with a mix of awe and horror. They were masterpieces of Victorian engineering, beautiful, rhythmic, and imposing. But they were also a lesson written in blood. They taught the industrial world a rule that remains true in nuclear plants, chemical refineries, nor in battery factories today. Concentrated energy is synonymous with concentrated risk. The spinning giants are gone, but their legacy remains. Every safety casing, every RPM limit, every material stress test we use today can trace its lineage back to those terrified moments in the 19th century, when the engine room shook, the iron screamed, and the heart of the factory decided to tear itself apart.